Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ocean Expert Exchange. Scientists in every Florida school and the ANGARI Foundation are excited to have you join us for our live webinar events with ocean science and technology experts. In this monthly series, we dive into marine science and explore what's happening in the field, interesting careers, and more. Today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Joshua Patterson of the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences at the University of Florida, Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, about his work in restoration aquaculture. But first, we'd like to tell you a little bit more about our programs. Scientist in Every Florida School is a free program housed within the Thompson Earth Systems Institute at the University of Florida. The mission of SEFS is to engage Florida K-12 students and teachers in cutting-edge research by providing science role models and experiences like this today. We hope we inspire future stewards of our planet. The ANGARI Foundation is a nonprofit headquartered in West Palm Beach, Florida, and the foundation supports and promotes marine science research and education, and many of the foundation's primary initiatives involve its 65-foot research vessel, the RV ANGARI. In case you missed any of the information in today's preview slides, we'd like to remind you that you can submit questions for our scientist, Dr. Joshua Patterson, by typing those in the chat box at any time. We'll be getting to those questions shortly. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to Dr. Joshua Patterson. And Josh, I'm going to stop sharing and let you take over things from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate it. Let me get my share going here. Yes. Okay, that should be good. Hopefully, please let me know if you're not seeing the slides, but I think that should work. So yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm here today to talk about marine restoration aquaculture, and we'll get into a little bit of, I've only got 15 minutes to speak with you, so I'm going to kind of tell you an outline of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to start off with a little bit of my background, especially due to the student focus of this webinar. I want to let you guys know a little bit about sort of where I came from and how I got to where I am at the University of Florida. Many of you may not really have a grasp for what restoration aquaculture is when I say that term, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And then I want to go into a couple of example systems. So one of those is coral reefs, and another one of those is seagrasses. And then one of the things I'm really excited about is having some time to interact a little bit and get questions from you all. So please feel free to shoot those questions, and we'll get to them, as many of them as I have time to. So starting off with my background, I was fortunate enough to grow up in the Blue Ridge Mountains in southwestern Virginia. I played some sports. I spent plenty of time playing video games and watching TV. But another thing that I also did was I had a lot of unsupervised time to just run around in the woods, turning over rocks and kind of just exploring my curiosity. And so I really think that that's what created my interest in the natural world and in science in general, is just that basic curiosity. And so from there, I went to George Mason University up in Northern Virginia, and I got a degree in biology. I took classes like biology, chemistry, physics, and got a really solid foundation sort of broadly throughout the sciences. From there, I went to Kentucky State University in Frankfort, Kentucky, where I did a master's degree studying this paddlefish that you see me holding there in the left-hand photo. Really cool, big river, Mississippi River fish, a lot of cool adaptations and stuff like that. And the photo there on the right is we're drawing blood from one of these fish as part of my master's research, looking into sort of estimating how these fish use their energy and how much food they need to eat in an aquaculture setting. So that was the aquaculture angle there. Another thing I want to point out right here is this is obviously the Ocean Expert Exchange. And, I work now in marine systems quite a bit, but you might notice that from up to this point, I'm getting a master's degree. I have not really come close to the ocean. So one of the things I want to encourage students out there, especially, is I get a lot of even college students that think that they need to specialize and, they want to do science and they need to specialize in something. They need to start studying seahorses when they're, in undergraduate programs. And what I would say is just to try to keep your horizons as broad as possible. Just be broadly interested. That interest in science itself is really what's going to carry you through, more so than maybe a specific topic. So from Kentucky State, I went to Louisiana State University to work on my PhD, a little closer to the ocean here, and I'm actually working on this. It's a brackish water estuarine, so like half salty, half fresh fish. In the bottom left there, we're using a little counter. There's actually laser beams and there's fish larvae that are passing in front of those laser beams. And so we're counting these hundreds of fish larvae that we're stocking into an experiment. And on the right is a workshop where I'm teaching some folks how to use a water quality meter. So in the PhD, when you're earning your doctorate, it's sort of student becomes teacher a little bit, right? And you're really becoming an expert in some topic. I will also still say that the topic I did my PhD on is not necessarily directly related to the research that I do at the University of Florida now. So that just gives you another example of like, specialization is not, in my opinion, is not super critical early on. So finally, I was fortunate enough after finishing my PhD at LSU to get a job as a professor at the University of Florida. And what I want to point out there is, hopefully you've noticed in the previous couple of slides, most of those photos have more than one person in them. So science is really a team sport. I think some people potentially have this vision of a scientist in their lab with the door shut by themselves, working on experiments or papers or whatever. And some of that does happen. But it's one of the things I love about it is that you get to work with a bunch of different people. And so this is just a small subsample of some of the people. I've been at UF for 10 years now. So some of the people, everything from high school students to other professors that I've had the chance to work with. So said we were going to get into what is restoration aquaculture. So aquaculture is basically agriculture in the water, if you want to think of it like that. And then I'll give some examples of restoration aquaculture to hopefully help you wrap your head around that. One of those is stock enhancement. So some people might be familiar with this. There's a specific fish or some species that we like to catch or we like to harvest. And so we culture it. This photo is a salmon hatchery in Japan, and all of the orange material in those canisters is salmon eggs. So that gives you an idea of the scale here. There's a really high percentage of salmon that are caught in Japan that actually originate in hatcheries. And so that's a form of restoration aquaculture that we call stock enhancement. Another one is for threatened species. So this photo is of freshwater mussels. Freshwater mussels are actually the most endangered animal group in Kentucky, the state of Kentucky, where I did my master's. And so the state operates these restoration aquaculture hatcheries where they're spawning these mussels and growing them up to put them back out in their native streams. Not necessarily because they're like a vital component of the ecosystem, but just because they're threatened and we're interested in maintaining that biodiversity. And then finally, and this one might be the biggest stretch in terms of actually being aquaculture, but it's habitat restoration. So this photo is a boat in the Chesapeake Bay that's dumping out oyster shells. So it's not actually dumping out a live animal, but the intent is to modify the environment or change the environment such that little baby oysters have a place to settle and grow. And so I personally would consider that a form of aquaculture when you're intentionally modifying the environment to encourage something to grow. And we'll get back into that when we talk about the seagrasses later, because we're not actually growing seagrasses in like a hatchery or a nursery type area, but I still consider it restoration aquaculture. So in terms of this topic of restoration aquaculture, there's a few things that I always like to tell folks that are important to remember here. The first is that conservation is better than restoration. So restoration is expensive. It sometimes fails. In fact, some might say it often fails. And so if we can take actions to keep something healthy in place and not impacted in the first place, that's always preferable. The other thing is that restoration is one tool in a large box of overall sort of ocean conservation actions that we can take, right? So we need to make sure to not be saying that growing these things in nurseries and putting them back out is going to save the species or make everything back to how it used to be. Along with that is acknowledging the limitations, right? So this tool is an important tool, and it's one that I've been studying for 10 years now. But there's only so much it can do, right? Like in the coral example, we have ocean warming that's really impacted corals negatively. We have land-based pollution. When we talk about the seagrasses, we'll talk about impacts from boat propellers that are chopping up seagrass. So some of those impacts also need to be addressed alongside the active restoration that we're doing with these species. So we just need to make sure that we're clear on those things. All right, jumping into my examples now. So coral reefs, Florida is actually the only state in the contiguous US that has coral reef ecosystems. Hawaii also does. This picture here is from the 1970s. And there's a couple of species that you can see in this picture. On the bottom left is staghorn coral, the long skinny branches, and on the top right is elkhorn coral. Those sort of thicker, they look like an elk's horns. That's how they get that name. And so these two species occupied most of the area on the reef. There's about 40 species of coral in Florida and the Caribbean, but these were two of the sort of dominant species historically. Coral reefs occupy a tiny percent of the ocean floor, but it's been estimated that a quarter of all marine species rely on coral reefs at some stage in their life. So we call them the rainforests of the sea. They're extremely biodiverse, and they provide a lot of important services, including, you can see these big structures that are being built here by these corals, so including protection of the shoreline from waves and hurricanes and things like that. So unfortunately, I mentioned a lot of impacts. Coral reefs globally, especially in Florida and in the Caribbean, are really struggling, have been impacted. So this is the same area today, or not even today, 10 years ago in 2013. This is in Discovery Bay, Jamaica. There have been successive bleaching events from oceans getting warmer. There have been disease events that have caused coral decline. There was a die-off of a really important sea urchin that was a part of the ecosystem that I'll talk about a little bit later as well, that has also contributed to this. So those are all stressors that we need to address, of course, as I said before. But one of the things that we're working on is actively culturing corals in nurseries and putting them back out on the reef. These are a couple of the better photos that I've been lucky enough to take during some work that we were doing in coral nurseries in Florida. The coral itself is an animal. So I don't know if you're able to see the photo on the left, those little tiny polyps. They're almost like upside down jellyfish you can think of. But they live their entire life, each polyp in this cup. They get about 90% of their energy from photosynthesis. So they're also very much like a plant in the fact that they need sunlight. And then they're laying down this hard rock skeleton. So they're also kind of like a rock. And that's how they create these reefs over time that build up. One of the nice things about these corals is when you break them in half, they will continue to grow. So we're in the photo on the right, there's a student that's fragmenting a coral using some pliers there. And you would just attach that to another rope and put it in the nursery, and they'll continue to grow over time. So we take those corals from the nursery and we put them back out on the reef using a cement or epoxy. The photo on the left there is a pretty good representation of that. And then another aspect that my lab specifically has been working on, those little spiky black balls there are long spine sea urchins. And so there was a die-off of those guys in the early 1980s, and throughout the region, a huge die-off. And what they contribute is they actually eat the algae that competes with the corals. So there's these fleshy algae that can grow really fast that outcompete the corals, and these urchins keep the reef nice and clean. So those urchins were actually aquacultured in my lab in the Tampa Bay area and taken down to the Florida Keys, and we're working on ways to try to reinvigorate the populations of those urchins as well. The photo on the upper right is somebody monitoring some outplanted corals. So I'm not presenting any data or graphs today, but it is important that we don't just put the corals back and leave them. So we do go back and monitor them, and we can ask different scientific questions about the type of coral that we're putting out or the area that we've put it out in, and monitor also the temperature and things like that, and try to get better at the process of growing and putting these corals back out on the reef. So that's where a lot of my research focus has been. I also said I want to talk about seagrasses. Seagrasses are really cool. They're a lot like corals. They provide an important habitat for a lot of different fish species. And they've been impacted by things like water quality in a lot of areas. However, in some areas where the water quality has been okay, propeller scarring. So in the bottom right of this photo, if you can see those sort of unnatural straightish lines there, those are propeller scars. And I've got a video where I'll show you those in the water. And we have a technique, an aquaculture technique, to sort of restore those scars, because what happens is with some of the scars, the seagrasses cannot grow back sort of like downhill. So the scars create a trench. And so I'll get into that a little bit. This is part of a larger project that I just want to point out is led by Dr. Savannah Berry. I'm a small part of it, and I'm only going to talk a little bit about my part of it today. So as I mentioned before, seagrasses are really important. We're super lucky in Florida to have a couple of globally significant seagrass areas. So one where this project is in the Big Bend of Florida, that's highlighted there. And then at the south tip of Florida is Florida Bay. And those are areas where we've got a lot of shallow water. Seagrasses are plants and they need lots of light. And so they need to be in relatively shallow, clear water. And so those are areas where we've got these really nice seagrass meadows, which I'll show you in this video now. So thanks to Shane White for shooting and putting together this video. As the drone rises here, hopefully you can see some of those propeller scars that I was talking about. And we're going to dive down into the water here in a minute, and you can see the grass and really see what those propeller scars look like. So as I mentioned, so part of this project is we're studying these scars, because what we're finding is that some of these scars recover on their own. So there's a nice propeller scar photo. And some recover on their own and some don't. So if we can figure out, and this is Dr. Annie Hensel. She's sort of the lead for this particular part of the project. So she spent a good part of her summer out in the field doing this right here. So we're trying to figure out what characteristics of these scars lead them to either recover or not. And then the ones that don't recover are the ones that we can prioritize for restoration aquaculture, which is what I'll show you in the next slide here. So this is from a previous project that I was part of. And those are sediment tubes that they're throwing to the person in the water there. So those are just cotton tubes full of sediment. So as I mentioned, part of the issue is that when the propeller creates a trench, the grass cannot kind of grow down the hill. So all that you have to really do, assuming that the grass on the sides is healthy, is fill that tube or fill that scarp with sediment. And what we found, at least in this area, is that the grass will recolonize. So again, there's a protection issue here because we need to hopefully, create some zones where these propeller scars aren't going to keep happening, and then potentially identify the ones that are not going to repair themselves and go in and perform this restoration aquaculture. So I thought that was a nice shot to kind of end on. Shows you the beauty of the areas where I get to work. So with that, I will wrap it up, and thank you so much for your attention. And again, happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Patterson, for talking to us about what it takes to improve habitat quality and enhance species populations with aquaculture. We're now going to begin the Q&A portion of today's Ocean Expert Exchange. If anyone tuning in has any questions, please type them in the chat box and I can ask them for you. So first question is, Hannah and her sixth graders are wondering, how does seagrass get pollinated under the water, and how is that different from flowers on land?
Wow, that's a great question. It's not super different from flowers on the land. So seagrasses are flowering plants. And to be honest with you, that would be a great question for an up and coming scientist. There is not a ton known about how they get pollinated underwater, but they do bear a fruit. Kind of looks like a seed, but it's technically a fruit, and it floats off and settles in a new location. And so, yeah, they're able to spread that way. But in terms of how the pollen gets to the flower, obviously, yeah, it's not a lot is known.
Interesting. And interesting how that's not yet been answered by science. So could be a potential project, like you said, for new scientists.
Yeah, exactly.
So next question is from Angelo, who asks, Dr. Josh, which marine animal would you say is the hardest to get set up and successfully raised for aquaculture?
Sure. So if you recall, I could scroll back, but the photo that I showed you of the coral with the little long-spined urchins out in front of it, that is the hardest animal to raise. I've been doing aquaculture for almost 20 years now, and that one took us. That was somebody's whole PhD project, was figuring out how to raise that urchin. So those are the trickiest.
Any specific reason for the urchin being difficult?
Yeah, they're super sensitive to everything. So there are some papers out there. They are the most sensitive marine invertebrate to dissolved heavy metals. They're super sensitive to water quality. They're in a larval phase for a month and a half or more, and they don't swim very well. So we have to mechanically sort of keep them suspended, feed them algae that we grow for a month and a half, and they die on you in the blink of an eye. So
And then the next question is from Arnold, who wonders what marine animal or plant you think has the most potential for aquaculture, or what is your favorite to work with?
Yeah, interesting. So in terms of not necessarily direct restoration, I guess, but the question, I guess, was aquaculture in general. So I'm fascinated by seaweed aquaculture and the potential that that has from like a sustainability perspective. And, it's really nutritious source of protein and fatty acids and stuff like that. So I think seaweed would be one of greatest potential in my mind. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question, Lexi?
Oh, it was what is your favorite like marine animal or plant to work with, like in your career?
Um, if it has to be marine, so the paddlefish was really cool, and that's my favorite fish, but that's a freshwater fish. Um, yeah, probably. Well, I'm starting to do some stuff with sponges. Sponges are really cool, so I'll just leave it there as sort of a cliffhanger. Like, yeah, the newest one, sponges. Check out sponges; they're cool.
Sponges are all really cool. Yeah, you're right. So a student would also like to know how resource intensive it is to observe natural habitats.
In terms of like time or carbon emissions, or so it's relatively resource intensive. It depends, of course, on how far away it is from you, right? So where I'm based in Florida, we're a 5-hour drive from the Keys. So when we go to study reefs in the Keys, it's it takes more time. We have a lot of collaborators throughout the Caribbean who are based on islands and can step out their door and jump in a boat and be out on the reef in 10 minutes. So I would say it varies, but yeah, it can be quite resource intensive.
And then Mr. Lichtig and his Jupiter High School students would like to know overall how well are seagrasses doing in Florida now? Are they still declining or are they kind of coming back or like what's the status?
Yeah, great question. So I should have mentioned this. So seagrasses globally are declining, not at the rates that coral reefs have and are. But in Florida specifically, seagrasses, it's it's somewhat specific on like a bay to bay basis. So I can give you the example of Tampa Bay where I live, and the seagrasses have made an amazing recovery from I think it was the 70s and 80s where there was a lot of nutrient pollution in the bay, and we figured out sort of what was going on. Spent billions of dollars in infrastructure for wastewater management and stuff like that to try to remove all these nutrient inputs that were going into the bay. And the seagrasses recovered. I think it was in 2016 where we hit 1950s acreage, 40,000 acres of seagrasses in Tampa Bay. They've declined a little bit since then in recent years. And there's other, Sarasota Bay is another relatively recent success story. So yeah, in Florida, I think they're doing pretty well overall. There's some issues in the Indian River Lagoon. Seagrasses are not doing well over there because of nutrient inputs and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a mixed bag.
I feel like a mixed bag is pretty standard for a lot of these systems. So another question is a group of 6th grade students are wondering if you can talk a little bit about what happens to the ocean food chain if coral reefs or seagrass beds go away.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, both of those habitats in some ways sort of form the base of a food chain. Seagrasses, especially. Corals, there are some species of fish and stuff that directly feed on corals. But the coral is more about the physical structure, I feel, that it provides. So they provide all these little hiding spaces and stuff like that. There are invertebrates and things that feed on coral that are then eaten by fish. So there's a bit of a base of a food chain kind of thing there. Seagrasses are also important for their structure that they provide. And they're directly consumed by things like manatees and sea turtles and stuff like that. So they're important from that aspect as well.
And then Miss Labson's students would like to know how you introduce coral back into the water and how it stays down in the water.
Sure. So it sinks naturally. So it's like attached to the bottom. We call that benthic. So that heavy rock sort of skeleton that I mentioned actually sinks. So in the in-water nurseries, the coral is really never taken out of the water. So those photos that I showed were in an ocean-based nursery. And so those structures where the coral is hanging from are actually in the ocean, and then it's just fragmented and taken back to the reef. And then when it is stuck back to the reef, we use cement or epoxy or some sort of adhesive, typically. That is what sticks it back to the reef.
Gotcha. And you also mentioned previously that the corals are more important for the structure and like you're going out and outplanting them. So I guess how fast do the corals grow, like from when you raise them for aquaculture, compared to like previously, like naturally, if that makes sense?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I mentioned that I think there's about 40 species of corals. So I only talked about two. And so your mixed bag comment earlier is apropos here as well. So the staghorn coral that I think you're still seeing in the background of this photo actually grows quite fast. So each of those tips can grow, fast being like, I don't know, 10 centimeters a year, something like that. So, that particular colony that you see there may only be a year or two old. So they grow from each of those branches. There's also what we call boulder or massive corals. And those are, if you think of like a brain coral head, those grow much, much slower than these branching corals. So actually the coral to the left there of the staghorn coral is a massive species.
And we have a lot of students in the audience, from elementary to high school. Can you give any suggestions as to how students are able to help in your efforts with marine aquaculture restoration?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can look for public aquariums and things like that to sort of volunteer. Most public aquariums are going to have pretty active sort of conservation programs and departments. So that would be one thing that hopefully would be accessible to most folks, is like a public aquarium. If you happen to live near the ocean, there are, nonprofit foundations and others like that are active in this sort of space that often are interested in taking volunteers.
And then Mr. Saad from Rockaway Middle School student asks, Dr. Patterson, you mentioned that the restoration aquaculture can sometimes fail. So what are some of the biggest challenges that cause these projects not to work, and how do you try to fix them?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are just, nature, right? So I mentioned like ocean warming. I had one of my first students, we did this whole big coral outplanting project, and then Hurricane Irma hit. If y'all remember, that was, I don't know, 10 years ago, Hurricane Irma hit the Florida Keys. It was really devastating. And it wiped out about half of her, corals that she had outplanted for her research. We were able to salvage it, and we actually found some really interesting things where like the corals that were closer to shore were kind of protected by the reef, and actually survived okay. So yeah, things like that, hurricanes. 2 summers ago here in Florida, we had a really marine heat wave, like a really severe marine heat wave, that even corals that were in nurseries were getting wiped out by that. And so specifically to corals, there is some interest in trying to identify genetics in corals that lead them to be more heat tolerant and things like that. So that is one sort of avenue of research that people are looking into.
Gotcha. So it sounds kind of like there's some hope, but also still a little bit of a mixed bag on that front.
Exactly. Well put.
And then final question, Miami Lakes K-8 Center wonders what advice you would give to students who want to become marine scientists in the future.
Sure. Yeah. If, as I sort of mentioned off the top, in my opinion, and just being curious and passionate about science in general, people are attracted to marine science because it's like, you're scuba diving and there's blue water and it's sort of this like, seems like a really cool area. But to be honest with you, what I tell my graduate students is like, you need to be as willing to study microbes in Antarctic sea ice as you are coral reefs, because, the day-to-day is really not scuba diving, and the day-to-day is like a little more mundane than that. So if you're not passionate about the science at a basic level, it's kind of really hard to maintain in my opinion, just being sort of passionate about a coral or something like that.
Well, that was really good advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Patterson.
Sure.
Okay, well, we want to thank everyone for joining and tuning in with us today. A very special thank you to Josh Patterson for taking time to share his work with us on aquaculture for marine restoration. I would also like to take time to let you know that there are K-12 extension resources related to today's topic. We've made those available along with a recording of today's talk. You'll find that on the UF Earth Systems YouTube channel. We also wanted to just mention you can learn more about Scientists in Every Florida School and the ANGARI Foundation by visiting our web pages seen here on the screen. And please follow us on social media. Let's see. So today was just the first event of our fall series. We have some more fascinating exchanges on the way. We hope you'll join us for our next live webinar on November 6th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will be joined by Jennifer Norcross. She will be sharing her work on the movement of the Atlantic guitarfish. I'm excited for that one. The December 11th event at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be looking forward to hearing from Rick Householder. He will be sharing about his team's work with mapping the seafloor around Florida. In addition, we are already saving dates and putting those aside for our spring semester series. So be on the lookout, mark your calendars. We'll be providing additional details and making those announcements shortly. In the meantime, on behalf of Scientists in Every Florida School and the ANGARI Foundation, we want to thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on a future Ocean Expert Exchange. Thanks, everyone. Bye.